Welcome back. In this video, we'll be discussing the Aztecs and the Incas. Those were some images from the Inca site Machu Picchu in the Andes Mountains. The big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video are, first, how did the Aztecs and Incas adapt to and affect their environments? Second, how were the Aztecs and Incas similar politically and economically, and how were they different? And then third, what cultural traditions did the Aztec and Inca continue, and how did these traditions change with the arrival of the Spanish? How did the Aztecs and Inca adapt to and affect their environment? In terms of the geography of the Aztec, we're really talking about the middle of Mesoamerica here, which is in the modern-day country of Mexico. So the Aztec, also known as the Mexica, were a society that dominated central Mexico from around 1400 to 1521. So they called themselves the Mexica, and that's where the name of the country Mexico is derived from. So the Aztec capital has a bit of a mythology or legend surrounding it. The Aztec people were out wandering, and they were told that they would found a city in a place where they saw an eagle clutching a snake standing on top of a cactus. So according to Aztec legend, the gods told the Aztecs to build the city where they found an eagle holding a snake in its beak perched on top of a cactus, and they found this right here on this island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. And so this symbol of the eagle holding a snake on a cactus is very important to the modern-day country of Mexico. It's the centerpiece of their flag. And so the modern-day country of Mexico takes great pride in its Aztec or Mexica heritage. At this site, on this island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, the Aztecs built their capital called Tenochtitlan. So it was built on Lake Texcoco with a series of bridges and canals connecting it. And so you can see these canals and the bridges that were put in place in order to reach this massive city. When the Spanish show up, they are just blown away. They're astounded by the sort of beauty and size of this city. They describe it as more impressive than anything that existed in Spain at the time. Today, Tenochtitlan is the site of the modern-day city of Mexico City. And so Lake Texcoco has been drained. Mexico City was founded on the exact same spot where Tenochtitlan once stood. So whenever you're living on an island, there's a lot of challenges. One is that you need to get access to farmland. And so one of the ways that the Aztecs adapted to their environment was they built these chinampas. Chinampas are these man-made floating gardens. And they used sticks and mud from the floor of Lake Texcoco, and they created these man-made floating islands. And they were incredibly rich soil, and so it was very productive in terms of their agricultural production. So the effect of these chinampas increased agricultural production, allowing them to increase their population. So a great example how human beings adapt to their environment, and then the impact of that, the effects of that, is increased agricultural production. Cocoa was a very important plant to the Aztecs. They would turn it into this drink like a hot chocolate, and they drank it for ceremonial purposes. Cocoa beans were used as currency. Their chocolate was very different than the way we experience chocolate because they didn't have any sugar. Cocoa on its own has a very bitter taste. Now let's turn to the Incas. So the Incas built their empire on the west coast of South America. And right along here, we have the Andes Mountains. And so the Incas were a large centralized South American empire located along the Andes Mountains. The modern day countries that we're talking about are Peru, Bolivia, Chile. So the Incas' capital was called Cusco. It's in the modern day country of Peru. When you think about Cusco, maybe if you've ever seen the movie Emperor's New Groove, you're thinking about this guy, Cusco, and that's because of the connection between the Emperor's New Groove and the Incan people. So the city of Cusco is actually kind of unique. Originally, it may have been built in the shape of a puma. So you can see maybe the outline. They built into the side of this mountain, and so they built the streets the shape of a puma. So there's the puma, which was a cat that was localized to that region. So very interesting. In terms of their accomplishments, the Inca also built an amazing site up in the Andes Mountains known as Machu Picchu. So we can see here a view of Machu Picchu. located in the middle of the Andes Mountains. So Machu Picchu is probably the most famous Incan site today. Now, it was very well preserved because it wasn't known to Spanish colonists. It wasn't discovered until 1911. It really is that well hidden in the Andes Mountains, and therefore it's very well preserved, whereas the Spanish destroyed a lot of the other architecture that was developed by the Aztecs and Incas. Machu Picchu was one that was actually very well preserved until 1911 because it wasn't known. It was most likely a vacation home for the Emperor Pachacuti. And if you think, wait a second, Pachacuti, that also sounds like Pacha from The Emperor's New Groove, was that character who was friends with Cusco. And it was Pacha's house, if you recall, that Cusco was trying to turn into his own vacation home. So there's just a little bit of, if you've ever seen that movie, we just need to unwind a few of the things and make them a little bit more clear in your mind. So here we see Pacha's home on the top of the mountain, and again, Cusco was trying to turn that home into his own vacation home. So when you go to Machu Picchu, it's just absolutely breathtaking. Here we can see Pachacuti giving us a tour of his amazing crib with these amazing views of the Andes Mountains, and so you can tell just how incredible of builders they were to build this elaborate construction this high up in the Andes Mountains with just llamas is incredibly impressive. The Inca were incredible stone builders, and what's even more impressive is they built these and they chiseled them just perfectly to size. There actually is no mortar between some of these stones, which is incredible in terms of the precision of their building. They also developed a terrace farming system. Whenever you're living at elevation, you need to get a way to access crops. So very much like the way the Aztecs developed chinampas in order to adapt to their environment of living on an island, so too did the Inca in order to adapt to their environment of living in the mountains. And so they developed this terrace farming system, and they would put stones along the face of the mountain in order to prevent erosion. And they could grow crops at different elevations, and that's how incredible they were in terms of their understanding of their environment. And this system was developed independently in many different parts of the world. So the Incas developed terrace farming, so too did the Chinese in order to provide farmland in regions of China that are higher elevated. The Incas also developed a waru system. So in order to get water to their crops, they had to build these sort of elevated platforms known as waru, and then they were very well irrigated with water on both sides of the raised bed. So they used waru farming, and this technique is still used today in parts of South America where the access to water is a bit of a problem. So you can see these waru raised field and irrigation systems. Now the Incas were incredible farmers. They grew many different varieties of potatoes. Whenever I go to Wendy's, I order French fries and then a Frosty, and I dip my French fries in my Frosty. I always thank the Incas for developing the potato and the Aztecs for growing that coca, that chocolate. The Incas were also incredible road builders. They constructed these amazing roads connecting and unifying their empire. Whenever they had a gap, sometimes they would develop these suspension bridges. This is a suspension bridge that is weaved out of plant fibers, and so this bridge has to be reconstructed like every single year. Somebody who has, the tradition has been passed down, is constantly building this suspension bridge and replacing these ropes throughout the year. So just incredible. They also built roads into the side of mountains. This is near Machu Picchu. This is called the Steps of Death, and you can kind of see why. So pretty incredible working at these very, very high elevations. So the Inca built an extensive system of roads through the Andes Mountains, connecting and unifying their empire. And if we were to draw a connection between a previous empire that did something very similar, we may draw comparisons to the Romans, for instance, who built their extensive network of roads. We could also connect it to the Persians, who first developed the royal road system connecting their empire. So how are the Aztecs and Incas similar politically and economically, and how are they different? So in terms of their political characteristics, the Aztecs and Incas, like many empires before them in other parts of Afro-Eurasia, were ruled by a powerful central leader that received authority and the right to rule from the gods, the divine right to rule. Some names of some leaders you should just be familiar with. Montezuma, who was the last Aztec ruler at the time that the Spanish conquered the Aztecs. Pachacuti, the great Incan leader who unified the Incan Empire and also built Machu Picchu.
Gangsta party. Party. Ain't nothing but a gangsta party. Party.
And then my personal favorite, Tupac. Tupac Shakur's mom apparently was very much into history and named Tupac after this great Incan king. So the Aztecs, in terms of their political characteristics, they conquered these neighboring tribes around them and expanded their empire through military conquest, but then they forced those various tribes to pay tribute to them. And the net effect of this was that those tribes also then were not incredibly loyal to the Aztecs, and so oftentimes this resulted in enemies. And we're going to see this as being one of the explanations for why the Spanish were able to so quickly defeat the Aztecs with very few conquistadors of their own. So what is tribute? So tribute is payment made by one state to the ruler of a more dominant state. We saw this kind of political structure in the Mongol Empire and the way in which they ruled Russia and those Russian principalities, where those princes were basically forced into making tribute payments to the Mongols in return for the Mongols not destroying them. In contrast to this form, a tributary form of political rule, the Incas are going to build a far more traditional empire with a more elaborate bureaucracy and more traditional unity. And we're going to see this, for instance, in the construction of this major road system that we described that was utilized to connect the Incan Empire across nearly all of the western portion of South America. Now, in terms of their economic characteristics, the Inca also required their citizens to engage in mandatory public labor, and this type of system is known as corvée labor. We talked about it previously when describing how the Chinese built the Great Wall of China and the Grand Canal. But when it comes to the Incas, there's a special name for their form of corvée labor, which is the mita system. So it's through this mita system that the Incas were able to build this incredible system of roads across the Andes Mountains. And they were able to also provide enough food and develop some of the various other agricultural techniques that they develop, like the terrace farming system. Now, in terms of the cultural traditions, what cultural traditions of the Aztecs and Incas continued, and how did these cultural traditions change with the arrival of the Spanish? So the Aztecs and Incas were both polytheists. They worshiped multiple gods, and those gods were in control over various forces in nature. So the Aztecs worshiped various gods, such as Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli. Now, these Aztec gods very much demanded blood. We can see this in this image of Huitzilopochtli sitting on top of this Aztec pyramid, which is covered with blood. This is evidence of the various practices of human sacrifice that the Aztecs participated in, oftentimes against prisoners of war. So these massive pyramids were built by the Aztecs, like this one at Tenochtitlan in modern Mexico City. And here's what they look like today. So as a result of the destruction of Aztec temples by the Spanish conquistadors. Now the Aztecs are going to continue many of the cultural practices of the Maya and the Olmec, such as the traditional Mesoamerican ball game, the idea of constructing and building pyramids and monumental architecture, that's the central part of their religion, and then finally that practice of bloodletting and ritual sacrifice, which was first developed by the Olmec and later continued by the Maya. So we can see a lot of these traditional cultural practices that are going to be continued throughout Latin American history. until ultimately the arrival of the Spanish. Now, the Inca, in contrast to the Aztecs, are going to rely on the one large domesticated animal that they have, which is the llama, and they're going to use that animal for meat and wool and for other purposes. Now, the Incas also are going to develop a very unique form of record keeping known as a quipu, and this was actually first developed back with Chavin, and then later societies of the Andes Mountains are going to continue to improve upon this technique, but this knotted string device known as quipus was really the only system of writing or record keeping that was maintained by the Incan people. So we have the Aztec here in modern day Mexico, and we have the Inca down here in South America. And ultimately, the Spanish are going to arrive, starting with Christopher Columbus on these islands in the Caribbean in 1492. And the Aztecs and Incas are the major civilization at the time of Spanish colonization. And that's why we spend so much time on them compared to other major civilizations and empires of Latin America. And so the Spanish conquistadors like Cortez and Pizarro are going to decimate and conquer, mainly because they have three distinct advantages, as Jared Diamond describes them: guns, germs, and steel. So the Spanish are going to impose many of their cultural traditions, which is going to be a major change in the religious traditions of Latin America as we move into the 16th century. The Spanish missionaries are going to come over and convert significant portions of the native population. So at the same time, many of the native peoples are going to retain some of these cultural traditions, and we're going to see basically a syncretic religious tradition in Latin American form, with Christianity becoming the dominant religion, but Christianity practiced kind of through the lens of many of these localized customs and practices. The big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video are: first, how did the Aztecs and Incas adapt to and affect their environments? Second, how were the Aztecs and Incas similar politically and economically, and how were they different? And then third, what cultural traditions did the Aztec and Inca continue, and how did these traditions change with the arrival of the Spanish? Thanks for watching.